friends, I hope you're all well and are having an amazing day. Today, I want to start this episode by expressing my deepest and sincerest condolences to those who have lost loved ones due to Hurricane Melissa or who have been negatively impacted by this hurricane. On October 28, 2025, when Hurricane Melissa landed in Jamaica as a Category 5 hurricane, there was major anxiety surrounding the impacts this would have on this beautiful island that many call home. Hurricane Melissa was the strongest hurricane of 2025 and is now considered to be the strongest hurricane Jamaica has ever experienced throughout its history. In addition to this, after making landfall in Jamaica, Hurricane Melissa stormed across the islands of Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Haiti. To date, Hurricane Melissa has led to 1 fatality in Cuba, 4 fatalities in the Dominican Republic, 43 fatalities in Haiti, and 35 fatalities in Jamaica. As climate change becomes more apparent in our everyday realities, it's important that we reflect on how hyperconsumption impacts the lives of vulnerable communities. To help shape our reflection, I wanted to spotlight the book Consumed: The Need for Collective Change, Colonialism, Climate Change, and Consumerism by Barber. So prior to getting into the book review and tying its relevancy to Hurricane Melissa, I want to provide some information on why and how climate change plays a role in the creation of hyper-hurricanes like Hurricane Melissa. In the article, Climate Crisis Means Super Strength Hurricane Melissa is a Dangerous New Reality, published by the Globe and Mail, Oliver Mignone states that the savage strength of Melissa was influenced by the overheated air and ocean caused by the heat-trapping emissions that come from the burning of fossil fuels, an international team of scientists has determined. Climate change increased Melissa's maximum wind speeds by 7% and extreme rainfall by 16%. The team at World Weather Attribution, a consortium of 20 researchers from the US, UK, Sweden, Dominican Republic, Netherlands, Jamaica, and Cuba found. Additionally, in the article, Jacob Campbell, who is a senior lecturer at the University of the West Indies, states that when a storm can explosively intensify from 70 to 185 miles per hour in less than 3 days over ocean waters that are 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than normal, we are witnessing the dangerous new reality of our warming world. To summarize, the carbon emissions that are emitted by the oil our cars burn, the electricity we use, and the manufacturing of the products we consume all emit greenhouse gases that trap heat and hence warm the planet at a rate that is neither sustainable nor habitable. Unfortunately, our need to consume at an unhealthy rate not only multiplies our individual greenhouse emissions, but multiplies the rate in which we make planet Earth uninhabitable for all. Unfortunately, this reality will lead to Hurricane Melissa becoming the standard, which results in the displacement of vulnerable communities that live on small islands or coastal regions. So this is why I felt it was necessary to focus this episode on the book Consumed: The Need for Collective Change, Colonialism, Climate Change, and Consumerism by Barber. So in the book, Aja illustrates that the normalization of hyperconsumerism is an ignored exponent of climate change due to being a legacy of colonialism. To illustrate how hyperconsumerism is a legacy of colonialism, the book features a roundtable discussion in which Swati Deepak illustrates how the colonization of India gave roots to hyperconsumerism. Specifically, Swati Deepak states that when the British East India Company set sail for India in 1608, its sole purpose was to disrupt and unseat the Indian textile trade and market, which was the strongest, biggest, and most profitable in the world at the time. The East Indian Company went on to be the gateway company to British rule, exploiting my company and ancestors and extracting and destabilizing the natural resources in the region. and when the British left, it was one of the poorest. Britain took an estimated $45 trillion from India over 173 years of colonial rule. And in 2019, Nitin Singh and Nikhil Venkatesa wrote in a story, the East Indian Company didn't just focus on crippling the Indian handlooms and weavers with their price-fixing strategy and enforcing through violence. They also adopted long-term taxation strategies to ensure that the Indian textile trade would be permanently crippled. And you can find this on page 42 to 43. This same level of violence was done to West Africa. In the roundtable discussion shared in the book, Dominic Drakeford states that, I think the history of the fashion or slave trade as we know it leads to the cotton boom and industrial revolution is a more well-known historical timestamp as it relates to the creation of the fashion industry and our current capitalist society as a whole. But in West Africa, indigo was an economic and spiritual currency across fashion, beauty, and wellness. West African women in particular were master dyers and traders, using their indigo wealth throughout ancient empires. However, it was a cornerstone of the transatlantic slave trade, one of the hidden commodities that fueled the European colonial empires. Africans were sought particularly for their agricultural skills in rice, sugar, cotton, but also their advanced skills in textiles, including cultivation of indigo plantations in America, the Caribbean, and South America, which used the expertise of Africans who were the sustainability experts of both agriculture and textiles. Again, you can find this on page 44 to 45. The European colonial empire's violent and inhumane extraction of India's and West Africa's resources not only helped set the tone for hyperconsumerism, but conceived a system, namely capitalism, that ensured the capital generated from hyperconsumerism disproportionately enriches white households in comparison to non-white households. Specifically, despite the extraction of various resources like bitumen from indigenous lands in Canada, Indigenous communities in Canada lack financing. For example, on April 29, 2025, Addenda Capital published an article titled The $500 Billion Gap, Understanding Indigenous Finance Challenges in Canada. This article states that the funding gap in housing, public infrastructure, and economic development for Indigenous peoples in Canada alone ranges from $350 to $500 billion. Many Indigenous communities lack financing for basic community needs, including adequate housing, healthcare, community facilities, and water infrastructure. In addition, many rely on high carbon emitting energy sources like diesel-powered generators for power production or lack access to telecommunication services. The funding gaps are often due to barriers to accessing financing for those needs and to Indigenous businesses. While Indigenous people in Canada account for approximately 5% of the population, Indigenous businesses hold less than 0.2% of the available credit. Access to market capital for Indigenous businesses is 11 times lower than that of non-Indigenous business pairs. Now, the goal of highlighting this isn't to frustrate you about the unethical practices of capitalism, but to illustrate that the fundamental purpose of capitalism hasn't changed from the time of the Atlantic slave trade to now. Even though we live in the era where representation matters, we fail to realize that the communities that were historically brutalized to be rid of their resources for the European empire's wealth accumulation continue to be disproportionately represented in management positions, death rates, poverty rates, homeownership, and the list goes on. Therefore, capitalism, like colonialism, mainly benefits white communities and those with close proximity to whiteness. So I guess if we remove capital from capitalism and place race before ism, it is again racism. It is because of this racism that non-white communities who play a part in hyper-consumerism but are less likely to benefit from it financially are more likely to be affected by climate change. For example, the article Why Climate Change is Inherently Racist states that Zambia has been experiencing the negative impacts of climate change, of climate variability, and change for the last 3 decades, says Zambian climate scientist Mulaka Kubisa. The biggest impact has been increased temperature and reduced rainfall, resulting in climate shocks that include droughts and floods. These changes in rainfall and temperature have resulted in crop failure, livestock deaths, and reduced the country's GDP, she adds. Droughts in particular have led to livelihood loss for the smallholder-dominated agricultural sector because production is dependent on the availability of adequate rain. So, how can we combat climate change? One, I encourage you to read the book Consumed: The Need for Collective Change, Colonialism, Climate Change, and Consumerism by Barber, because it contains insightful prompts on how we can advocate and become trailblazers for sustainable consumption. Two, I believe that in order to combat climate change, we need to collectively demand that policymakers, entrepreneurs, and we consumers reinvent a transactional system that is not tied to the violent and racist nature of colonialism. As such, non-white communities should be given an equal opportunity to voice what they believe should ethically replace capitalism. So, to start this conversation, I believe capitalism should be replaced by a transactional system that is unbiasedly respectful of planet Earth and of all persons. So while we find the courage to start these conversations and take action towards a more sustainable and equitable future, I would like to encourage you to spend time reading about the climate financing small islands are seeking from developed nations. To be brief, the article, Climate Financing Special Circumstances of SIDS, Key for CARICOM, states that climate financing for SIDS, including those in CARICOM, require a fraction of the amounts needed to reduce global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So, SIDS and those in CARICOM only need half of $1.3 trillion for their survival of climate-related crisis. If this is something that will be of interest to you, I encourage you to read more and encourage your local policymaker to make this a priority in support of neutralizing the discriminatory effects of climate change. Your voice matters. This month, COP30 will be taking place, and the small islands need your support in advocating for climate financing to protect vulnerable communities from hyper-hurricanes like Hurricane Melissa. So please encourage your local policymakers to make this a national priority. Also, if you have the means to donate to Jamaica's hurricane recovery, I encourage you to donate to the government of Jamaica's hurricane relief. To donate, click the link in my description. So, I know today's episode was a heavy one, and I feel like they always are, but it's important that these discussions are had. We all need to be a part of the climate change conversation. Each one of our voices are important and need to be heard. So, thank you for watching today's episode and share in the comments what you think should replace capitalism. I love you guys. Bye.